With that, I'm happy to hand it over to our partner for tonight's event, Mediaite, who covers the intersection of media and politics. And the moderator for tonight's event is Andrew Kirell, Mediaite Senior Editor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. You can hear me? So just before we get started, I wanted to thank the Koch Institute for facilitating this, and also obviously the museum for hosting this. We at Mediaite are incredibly excited to continue this conversation. The questions that Sam alluded to are incredibly important after Snowden's leaks, and they're going to get more important, and they've sort of fell out of favor in the news cycle. So it's sort of our duty to keep it going and try to answer these questions, and they're difficult. And I want to start with our former ambassador, John Bolton. He is the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under President George W. Bush, also served positions under President Reagan and President George H.W. Bush, and is currently the senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and also a commentator on Fox News. You may recognize him from that. So thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Glad to be here.
So I want to start a little broadly. You've been a consistent defender of surveillance in general, and sort of security programs under both President Bush and Obama, and that's sort of different than the pundit class. They've changed depending on who's president. And so with that consistency, is your view essentially just trust the government, just trust that they won't abuse this, that they know that they're going to do this okay?
Of course not. I don't trust anything the government does, but you have to start with the proposition that you can agree or disagree with, that the United States faces threats internationally. Mm-hmm. And the purpose of the surveillance that we're talking about, or that's been the subject of the news, is to gather foreign intelligence, to gather information about foreign threats to the United States. That can have implications for American citizens, to be sure, but which is not a domestic surveillance program. It is a foreign intelligence gathering program. Mm-hmm. And I think that's fully justified. I think it's important in this setting with this group to recall Adam Smith, who says in The Wealth of Nations, the first duty of the state is to protect the society against the violence and invasion of other societies. And that's what this is directed at. They're not looking for who you're schmoozing with in your spare time. It's not directed at that. It is a foreign intelligence gathering operation. So if you've got a complaint about what the FBI is doing in your daily life, go talk to them. If you're talking about NSA, you're talking about something very different.
And how effective have the policies actually been, especially surveillance? I mean, have we actually prevented attacks?
That's not the only purpose of the surveillance. The surveillance is to gain intelligence about not just terrorist activities, but the activities of foreign states and others that wish to do us harm. And let's not forget, in this context, that we face not just Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, we face the likes of China, which has the most sophisticated, advanced cyber warfare capabilities of any country on the planet, which has used them to hack into, by the Pentagon's estimate, the entire body of the top 1,000 American corporations, into the government in many different places, into AEI of all places. This is an ongoing struggle that requires American defensive and, I might say, offensive capabilities as well.
So that's foreign intelligence gathering, but I mean, can you see why domestic intelligence gathering may put a little bit of a fear in a lot of people? I mean, the automatic reaction is always, essentially what you're saying sounds effective, but it also sounds scary to a lot of people.
Well, there's obviously an overlap, and I think that's where people have a legitimate concern. But let me see if I can put this in some context. I think part of the problem is that when people hear about these NSA techniques, they say to themselves, well, I'm important, and, you know, I could be the subject of surveillance. I probably should be the subject of surveillance, and in fact, I probably am being surveilled, and I'm outraged by that. Let me just tell you, you, everybody in this room, we are dust in the wind for the NSA. Dirt in the road. They couldn't care less about what we do. And I know that's insulting to most of us, that they don't care, but unless you're cavorting with terrorists, when the algorithm sweeps across your electrons, goes right past.
But there's also there is the presumption, there is no presumption of criminal activity when they collect metadata for everybody. I mean, that's not necessarily...
That doesn't bother me in the slightest. The reason they're collecting, and at this stage I take your question to mean just collecting, is so that it's readily available to the government. You don't have to go to Verizon to ask them. And at least in theory, and I admit this theory may be flawed, but at least in theory it's not subject to manipulation, or it's harder to manipulate than if it were sitting in Verizon's files. And given China's cyber warfare capabilities, given the ability to transform those electrons if they're in a non-secure location, I'd rather have the metadata stored in a government location where presumably it's safer. As I say, that's subject to challenge. One wonders how Bradley Manning and Edward Snowden got their access to all this supposedly secure information. That argues for making it more secure, not for leaving it with the telephone companies.
Now, one of the interesting things, well, before do you think the safeguards that are currently in place to sort of protect people from, I guess, the fears that they have, do you think those are effective enough right now, the safeguards that we have?
I don't think we have evidence that they're not effective. And, you know, we have statements from Edward Snowden, many of which I know from my own knowledge are simply wrong. If there's evidence of impermissible manipulation of the data, impermissible use of the data, then I want to hear about it just as much as everybody else. But I tell you, what you've got out there now is a lot of scare stories, a lot of misinformation, and a lot of propaganda. And until we get to hard facts, I'm very skeptical that this is going to turn out to represent anything like the kind of problem that's been portrayed.
So speaking of Snowden, I don't want to go too far into him. I don't want to ask whether he's a traitor or a hero or any of that, but...
Ask me. Go ahead.
No, I know your answer. I know your answer. But interestingly, you know, the amount of access that he got, does that trouble you at all? That the incompetence of the government?
Absolutely. And it's not just because he was working for a contractor. I don't think you can lay it off on the contractors. I think Bradley Manning shows the problem is in the government as well. And I would be very worried that somebody who can do what Snowden has purportedly done, somebody else could do for fun or profit on their own. So I regard it as extremely dangerous and worrying that somebody can claim to have the kind of access that he had, forget his motives for a minute, to be able to take that data outside the confines of the government, and whether he's giving it to China or giving it to Russia or giving it to the whole world, that kind of vulnerability for our surveillance capabilities is a threat not only to our national ability to engage in that kind of surveillance, but risks the privacy of the data that everybody's supposedly so concerned with.
And so, continuing on Snowden a little bit, you've said, we alluded to before, you've said he's a traitor, essentially, that he's aided and abetted the enemy. What I'm wondering is, do you feel squirmish at all about the idea of surveilling or considering journalists who aid and abet him to be, are they traitorous in their actions? Should journalists be silent when they are given information?
Well, I think obviously the culture of journalism in this country is very different than what it was when journalists never bothered to reveal that Franklin Roosevelt spent his time in a wheelchair. And I don't expect that you can go back to that. And I also don't think that there is a privileged class called journalists. You know, I think journalists might like to think they're sort of an elite. But I'm a lawyer. I mean, I know what an elite is. I went to law school for 3 years. I had to take a bar exam. I had to sweat for not quite 8 years to make partner at Covington and Burling. That's what a real professional elite is. Journalists don't cut it.
You lawyers.
And I would say further that part of the problem with law is the notion that only an elite can practice it. I personally favor deprofessionalizing law, medicine, and all the rest of it to remove the artificial barriers to entry that government certification creates. So I'm coming to the point where I don't think journalists ought to be moved into a class of people that we're trying to eliminate in other real professions. And what that says to me is that the argument for government law enforcement outside the confines of the people who are actually in the government or working for the government is hard to make. I have been involved in the government, in the Justice Department and the State Department, in considering what to do about leaks. They're very frustrating. But until the Obama administration and the 3 Republican administrations I served in, the number of leak prosecutions was infinitesimal because it was too hard, it was too unlikely to find the outside, it was too hard to find the leaker inside the government, let alone the journalist. So I view this with, I guess I would call it bemusement, that it takes a left-wing Democrat to go after the press when those squishy Republicans let them get away with it.
And selectively he goes after them. But I'm wondering if, I want to see where your line is, though, on surveillance. I mean, would you be okay to say, to prevent whistleblowing leaks, would you be okay with surveillance on congressmen and their staff as a means to preventing that?
Well, what I would like to see is a tighter system within the government so that the possibility of a Snowden or a Bradley Manning is reduced. I think it's an inevitable cost of doing business in the government that you're going to have the leaks, and I don't want to extend the protection too far beyond the bounds, although I think it's clear that members of Congress and their staff are the source of many of the leaks. Certainly that's where I get a lot of my information. And I think that's a problem. What I think that requires is greater discipline in the federal government itself and greater discipline on the part of Congress. I wouldn't extend that to journalists.
So what you're saying then, what I hear you saying is that journalists shouldn't be treated differently than individuals.
I don't think so. As a general proposition. Now, if I believed that somebody who calls himself a journalist was actually, for example, in the employ of a foreign government, that would change my mind. You can't just call yourself a priest and expect people to treat you in some special capacity, and I don't think you can call yourself a journalist and have that alone be the deciding factor. But as a proposition for real working journalists who don't get paid much, or at least that's what they tell us, I'd leave them alone.
So then did the DOJ, do you think the DOJ went too far or not when it labeled your colleague, James Rosen at Fox, when they labeled him a co-conspirator as a way to get at him for leaking information?
I think it was ridiculous, and I'd probably say the same thing about James Risen of the New York Times. You know,
how are they different then?
I don't think they are. That's my point. In other words, if you can go after Rosen as a co-conspirator for helping to induce somebody to leak, there's not a journalist on the planet you couldn't go after under the same theory.
So you think it has a chilling effect when government...
I don't think there's any question about it.
Oh, interesting.
What I want to chill are the government employees so that they don't leak in the first place. That is where I think the prime defense of the surveillance and security issues should be placed.
And so this is the distinction you would draw between Snowden and a leaker to Rosen, say, is that, or James Rosen himself, actually, the difference between the two of them is that Snowden wasn't...
Well, Snowden took an oath, I mean, among other things. To gain access to this confidential data, he had to pledge not to reveal it. Right. And it's, to me, a fatal blow to his credibility on a range of things that he took an oath and then violated it.
So let's say you're right about all this, and
let me just say, because you didn't ask the question I thought you'd ask, the response that I've heard, including on Fox News, is, but he has a higher duty to the Constitution. He has a duty to, because he's got something that none of the rest of us has, which is access to that data. He got access on a very precise condition that he wouldn't reveal it, and he violated the condition, and he deserves a lot of pain for having done that, leaving aside the national security implications.
Even if it was abuses he was exposing, you don't think it's justified for him to break that oath, essentially?
No. I think I can't say he's not able to do it because he obviously has, but right. He deserves to be punished for it. And if he were really sincere, he'd get his butt back to the United States and face the consequences.
Would you also? I alluded to this before, but I mean, would you? I guess the question then becomes, if there is a journalist who obtains information that is pertinent, say there's an imminent attack, or the United States is launching an imminent attack or something, and the journalist gets wind of that, do journalists have an obligation to stay silent when they have information?
I think what they ought to do, if they were patriots, they'd come to the government and say, we're worried about this. And some do, including the New York Times, amazingly. And I think at that point, the government can say, we feel very strongly you should not publish this.
Then don't they become sort of, I guess, patsies, or they become an arm of the government. Isn't their duty to sort of keep the government in check, the fourth estate?
Well, I think it's legitimate to ask the question whether journalists are part of the society that we're defending. Mm-hmm. And are they so privileged that we will defend them even though they're committing acts which are endangering our security? In World War II, the whole population went under the rubric loose lips sink ships. Some of these people seem to have it as a priority, and I think they have to ask themselves, it's their conscience they should examine and say, you want the benefit of a free society? Are you going to do nothing to help defend the rest of us? And, if you can't appeal to their conscience, I'm not sure what you can appeal to.
So then do you think, so I didn't want to go too far into Snowden, but I'm interested in your opinion.
you keep nosing around.
I know.
Just go ahead, ask me what I think of it.
So then, would you say then that Greenwald and the Washington Post had an obligation? They shouldn't have published the information that Snowden gave them?
Well, I would not have published it if I were the publisher of the Washington Post. And I'd like somebody to answer me a question. How come Greenwald keeps putting it out, but the Post isn't putting it out anymore? Some quote-unquote journalist in the audience can maybe answer that question for me.
Staying for journalists. Got to rethink my career. No. So then, I was about to ask this before. I said, so say you're right about everything. Say you're right that surveillance is effective.
That's fine with me.
Well,
Can I go now?
Isn't it better just to be transparent about it, at least to notify people that we're doing this, as opposed to the secretive courts and the NSA stuff scared people, rightfully, I guess, because this was going on, sort of almost a collusion between government and business, also with PRISM. Isn't it better just to be transparent about it? Hey, we're going to snoop, and here's how we're doing it, but not specifically how we're doing it, but that.
Well, we're going to have that debate whether we should have had it or not, and people are going to be on notice. I think a president who properly explained the steps that he's taking and that governments have taken to protect people would gain public trust, and most people wouldn't care about this.
Yeah.
And I think most people honestly don't care about it. I think the public opinion polls bear me out on that. I think part of the problem, when it comes at least to the Internet, is that people think, if they sit in their kitchen in their pajamas, that surely everything they're doing is private. And what they really should know is they should hear what Scott McNeely said in the late 1990s when he was head of Sun Microsystems, and I think the quote is, "There is no privacy on the Internet, get used to it." So that's from a guy who helped create the Internet, created the technology and the software that we use today. He understood it 15 years ago. I think properly explained, people would understand it and accept it.
So you said earlier, when we first sat down actually, that you don't trust the government to do many things. You're standard, sort of limited government perspective. But why do you trust government to run surveillance effectively without abuse? I mean, they seem to run everything else with education. Tends to be abuse. I mean, there's a cognitive dissonance, isn't there?
No, I said that I don't trust the government on anything, and I think there is a role for congressional oversight of these programs that they authorize and appropriate money for. And I think Congress has had oversight over the NSA programs as they have negotiated. What you have, the phenomenon is, and it happens time and time again, is Congress is briefed on a highly classified activity, and they sit there and they say, yeah, that sounds good, and that lasts right up until the point where there's public criticism. And then the members of Congress who have been briefed say, well, I was never told about that. Oh, I don't remember that briefing. Well, clean your ears out and pay attention to it. Or if you want a different settlement, if you want something other than Gang of Eight briefings or briefings to the chair and ranking minority members of the House and Senate Intel committees or whatever you want, Congress, come up with a different standard. I think that's more appropriate than the courts. I think in a matter of foreign intelligence in particular, I think the FISA court already has too much authority.
And I've just been informed we're out of time on this, so thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Great
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a quick break.